20 years ago, Democratic U.S. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota successfully captured his party's presidential nomination. Mr. McGovern was one of the first U.S. senators to oppose the Vietnam War. He campaigned on a platform to end the fighting in Southeast Asia, to cut U.S. military spending, and to provide a guaranteed annual income for all Americans. Senator McGovern was defeated in the general election by the incumbent president, Richard Nixon. He earned only 17 electoral votes compared to 520 captured by President Nixon. We talked with former Senator McGovern recently about his career in politics and his 1972 bid for the White House. In a moment, that discussion.
Former Senator George McGovern, on the occasion of the 1992 Democratic Party convention, we thought it would be interesting to look back with you on your own convention in 1972. What were your most vivid memories?
Well, as we approached the convention, my most vivid memory was whether or not I would actually win the nomination at that convention. I had won 10 primary elections, but the most important of those was the winner-take-all primary in California. And that was challenged by the late Vice President Humphrey and all the other candidates in a last-ditch effort to prevent me from getting the nomination. So I spent the last month, I suppose, before the convention on the telephone calling everybody that was a delegate to the convention, urging them to stay with the party rules on the winner-take-all California primary. If we'd lost the California delegates, or even a major part of them, it would have thrown my nomination into doubt. I might have gone to that convention and come home supporting somebody else for the presidency.
The rules in 1972 very different from the rules that the convention operates under today?
Not particularly. We were bound on the first ballot in 1972. This time, every delegate goes to New York, a free agent. They're probably morally bound to stay with the primary results in their state that brought them to the convention, but there's no legal or party rule that requires them to stay. That's one of the basic differences. I think there's another difference. We went into Miami in 1972, despite the cloud over the California question. We went into that convention in high spirits. There was an enormous air of expectancy and hope and fervor in that campaign. You could feel the electricity in the air in the days prior to the convention and at the convention itself. I can't recall any convention that I've ever attended where there was more pure joy and excitement and jubilation than there was at that 72 convention.
You mentioned that it was held in Miami. Was there any particular reason why Miami had been selected?
I suppose partly because it was in the South. We wanted to at least make some symbolic indication of our interest in that part of the country. Secondly, Miami is a great convention city. They have the facilities to handle a convention well and to do it smoothly. I think it was a good choice. The Republicans also went to Miami that year. They did better after that than we did, but we both started our conventions in the same city.
The conventions were televised by the networks in their entirety?
They were televised in their entirety, and as I think back on it, I'm appalled at how little attention we paid to that. We were looking at what was going on in the convention center. We were struggling with the nomination battle. We were thinking about what we would do in the campaign ahead, but we didn't have any of our top people really focusing on how we looked on television or how we used that time. I suppose that's one of the reasons I ended up giving my acceptance speech at 3 o'clock in the morning. Looking back on that campaign, frequently people say to me, what would you do differently if you were running it again? Well, obviously you learn a lot in a presidential campaign. You'd do a lot of things differently. I think you'd do everything a little better the second time around. But one thing I certainly would do differently in the age of television is not to lose an audience of 80 or 90 million people at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening and let the convention drag on and then give my acceptance speech at 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I think it was 3:40 a.m. when I finally said goodnight to the delegates. My wife saw the speech and heard it, and maybe the network anchors did, and a few of the sleepy delegates. We were on prime time out in Guam, and we ran well out there. But the great American audience that was watching that convention earlier, I'm sure, long ago turned it off before they got to my acceptance speech. This is not a minor matter because here I was, a junior senator from South Dakota, not all that well known by the American public. I have this huge audience out there that I could lay out my program for in the way I wanted to do it. I could say what I wanted to say, no interruption from you media people, nothing. I could just get up there and let the American people know what I wanted to do for this country. And if I do say it, I made a great speech, but I was about the only one that heard it, so I would certainly change that if I were running again.
Well, let's stay on the speech for a minute. What kind of themes did you strike in that speech?
I thought that the central theme of that campaign should center on calling the country back to its founding principles. We'd wandered off into Vietnam in a war that was unconstitutional, I think ill-advised, certainly not in the national interest. And we had done things over there, including the secret bombing of Cambodia, the use of pesticides to destroy crops, the use of all kinds of horrible instruments of warfare. The American people were embarrassed by it. They were troubled over the loss of their own sons. And at the same time, we'd forgotten about a lot of first principles here at home. This Watergate scandal was beginning to stir. There was evidence of corruption in the highest councils of government. So I sounded this theme in my speech, "Come Home, America." That was not a call for isolationism, as some critics later said. I have to take in mind that they didn't hear or see the speech given the hour that it was given, so you got to be a little tolerant with them. But if they had seen or listened to the speech, they would have heard me say, come back to the founding ideals, come back to the Constitution, come back to the Declaration of Independence, come back to the dignity and respect for human life. And this is what I was calling for in that speech. The delegates who heard it thought it was a great speech. One of the television anchors, whose name I won't mention, told me it was the best speech he ever heard in an acceptance speech. So that was the theme, and that was the context in which the speech was given. The great tragedy was the very limited audience it had.
How had you actually crafted the speech?
Well, I wrote a good part of that speech myself. Bob Shrum had a strong hand in it. Arthur Schlesinger had a hand in it. Adam Walensky had a hand in it. There were a number of different people, but basically it was my work. The phrases about "Come Home, America," the picture of wanting America to be a witness for the world. Those phrases were mine, and I think I can say that that speech was basically crafted by myself. I worked over every line of it. I'll tell you an interesting thing about the process of preparing that speech. I didn't really do the writing on it until we got to the convention. That's not a good place at which to write a thoughtful speech when you're on the phone every few minutes talking to somebody and you have to pick a vice presidential running mate and do various other things. But that speech was largely done at the convention. I gave it to my secretary to put on the teleprompter, and I never went through that speech once. I never saw it on the teleprompter until I stood up at the podium the night of the convention and delivered. I didn't know whether they'd typed it accurately. I didn't know really what a teleprompter looked like. I'd looked through one a few minutes at one time, but I didn't know where the plates were, or how the thing was going to work, or what the speed would be. And so if you ever heard a speech delivered that was semi-spontaneous, it was that one, because I was working entirely with unfamiliar equipment. I was told later that one of the Democratic candidates at a later convention rehearsed his speech with a teleprompter in the bedroom for an entire day before he delivered it. And I think that's probably more the rule than the exception.
Why did you take the risk of not rehearsing before?
There just wasn't time. We finished that speech, as I recall it, about 6 o'clock in the evening. It then had to be transcribed from my hieroglyphics and typed and then put on the teleprompter. And I thought that it had to be done by about 8 o'clock, which is when the convention went into session. I didn't realize I had until 3 o'clock in the morning to work on it, or I would have rehearsed it. But by then it was down at the convention hall, and you had a kind of a tradition then that candidates didn't appear down there until you came out to make your acceptance speech. So it frankly just didn't occur to me to go down there to the convention hall and start working on the speech. I suppose if I had gone down to do that, it had been picked up on television, that wouldn't have looked so good either.
What actually delayed your speech?
It was the fact that the delegates were just sort of feeling their oats and showing their newfound freedom as delegates at a convention. They were making speeches, they were insisting on being recognized, and they were nominating people for the vice presidency. A lot of them were just humorous nominations. I think, for example, Roger Mudd, who was then with CBS, was nominated by one of the delegates just to see his reaction up in the booth. Gloria Steinem was nominated. She might not have been a bad candidate, and Roger might not have been a bad candidate. But in any event, we had probably 40 or 50 nominations of people just to give people an opportunity to make different points they wanted to make. And then there was some argument about the rules and about the platform and various other things. And in the spirit of keeping it an open convention and letting everybody participate, Larry O'Brien, who was the chairman and presiding over the convention, just let everybody have their say. There again, if I were doing that over, I would have called the convention from my room and said, cut this off at 10 o'clock. I want to go on in prime time.
In fact, were you having discussions with your top aides about what you could do when you saw the hour getting later and later?
We had some conversations about it, but they told me it would be very difficult to cut off people because they'd promised everybody an opportunity to be heard.
When you look back on the speech and you talked about the content of it, did it in fact strike themes that you used throughout the fall campaign?
Yes, it did indeed. I remember saying one thing in that speech, that we had to put an end to closed-door government, that the people were entitled to know about decisions that are affected their lives, that we had to have an end of closed-door operations. I had one phrase in that speech about the war. I said, I want that war ended and the White House opened. Or I want the war closed and the White House opened. And there were other phrases that we referred to in that speech. I called in that speech for converting our unnecessary military outlays, that is the surplus part of the budget, to building up the country. That ought to be a great theme in 1992. I don't know why it isn't being emphasized more than it is this year, because 20 years later, you would think that just about everybody could see that our military budget is way beyond anything we need for defense purposes, and that the time has come to begin converting those surpluses to building up the physical infrastructure of the country, the roads, the streets, the waterways, the tunnels, the bridges. They're all falling apart, and we ought to put people back to work that are now working in defense industries or in the Army, building up the country and we could finance it with I think common sense cutbacks in the military budget. I was calling for that in '72. I called for it throughout the campaign. We also had a central point in that acceptance speech and in the campaign that there was a need for tax reform, for tax justice. I still think that's an issue that's very much in order.
You mentioned Bob Shrum. If you go through the list of some of your top aides, I think people who see politics today will recognize others who aided in your campaign.
Yeah, Bob Shrum was the best writer we had in the campaign. I think he's the best speechwriter in America, to be candid about it. But we had very talented people working in that campaign. John Holm of my Senate staff, who worked with Bob Shrum, was a wonderful idea man, good on the content of speeches, good on issues, a practical, thoughtful, very decent man. And he played a kind of an unheralded but important role in that campaign.
Your campaign manager, of course, was
and
Gary Hart.
I was just going to mention the writers. Sandy Berger was another very good writer. Milton Gewurtzman, who helped in the campaign, he was very good at writing. Adam Walensky, Arthur Schlesinger played some role in writing, although he kept telling me that he'd written for an earlier generation of candidates. But in any event, these were all very talented writers. Gary Hart was the campaign manager and did a superb job. Gary was especially good during that long bid for the nomination. He never got down. I never saw him discouraged. He could always talk to a group of potential supporters or contributors or skeptical journalists in a way that convinced them that that campaign made sense. They would say to him, how can George McGovern be taken seriously? He's at 5% in the polls. He's a junior senator from a little state with 4 electoral votes. How can you take him seriously? And Gary would say, watch us in May, watch us in June, watch us at the convention. And then he'd lay out, he'd tell them what our strategy was for winning the nomination, do it very effectively. I thought he was terrific as a campaign manager. Frank Mankiewicz. Frank played the role of political director of the campaign in the sense that he would kind of lay back and take a look at where we were going and what we were saying and what we were doing, the organizational questions, and he'd raise sharp questions. He'd make incisive suggestions of things we could do that would help us function better. We used to say he had a telephone growing out of his ear because he'd have a cigarette hanging out of this side of his mouth, the telephone up here, he'd be writing with this and looking at a book over here, reviewing somebody's report. He could do about 4 things at once. And his association with the Kennedy family gave him a special influence with a lot of the key Democrats, so that I would say Frank Mankiewicz was indispensable to the campaign. Henry Kimmelman, the finance director, did a beautiful job on finances. We ended up that campaign without any debt, and I give Henry Kimmelman much of the credit for that. Henry always thought it was as important how you spent money as how you raise it. It doesn't do any good to raise money if you're going to waste it on unimportant things. So that's where his great strength was. Morris Dees, the great direct mail expert who raised millions of dollars through direct mail. Tom Collins, who wrote a lot of those direct mail letters. These are some of the key people in the campaign.
Your pollster was Pat Caddell?
Pat Caddell, and Pat was very important. I think we paid him $50 a week. He was a Harvard student at the time, but he made his name in that campaign, and Pat was brilliant, no question about that. He did a wonderful job for us. Men like Gene Pokorny, who ran the Wisconsin and Nebraska primary campaigns, Joe Gramazon up in New Hampshire. These were good people. Gloria Steinem played an important part in rallying large numbers of people, men as well as women. Shirley MacLaine, who gave about 1.5 years of her time, never made a movie during that time. She was out campaigning full time. She added a kind of a spirit of optimism and fun and joy to the campaign. I always liked to travel with her. She was great out on the campaign trail. The audiences loved her. I don't want to go too long on this, but Warren Beatty, her brother, I think came up with just some of the most brilliant and creative ideas we've ever had in campaign fundraising. He put on these marvelous concerts with Barbra Streisand and Carole King and James Taylor and Dionne Warwick. We did concerts in one major city after another to raise money for the campaign. I think we raised $300,000 at the Los Angeles Forum, where the Lakers play, with Barbra Streisand as the headliner.
Was this the first time Hollywood had been involved in a presidential campaign?
It wasn't the first time, but it was far and away the heaviest input from Hollywood. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say we had over 100 top actors and actresses involved in that campaign. If you take that one concert out in Los Angeles during the California primary, you look at the ushers that were there. It's the top names in Hollywood who served just as ushers, so the public could see these celebrities. But Warren Beatty was the key to all that. He put these things together. He's a master show producer and a great fundraiser.
Do you see it all as pluses when Hollywood's involved in the presidential election process?
Well, it is for me. It kept my morale high. It kept the money coming in. I suppose some people frown on the fast lifestyle that they associate with Hollywood. I didn't see much of that, but in any event, I thought they made a tremendous contribution. I had a lot of NFL football stars in the campaign. They were organized by Ray Shunke of the Washington Redskins. I believe he had 19 or 20 Redskins signed up, and about the same number of Dallas Cowboys, which was the team he played with before he came to Washington. But I campaigned with Paul Warfield of the Miami Dolphins, formerly of the Cleveland Browns, and Deacon Jones of the Los Angeles Rams, and various other players, Charlie Taylor, of course, of the Redskins. They would take a couple of days at a time and go out and campaign with me. One thing you'll find amusing is that those great NFL football stars, and you know they're all Americans and superstars, in great physical shape, after a day of following me around on the campaign trail, they were absolutely exhausted. They'd say, "How do you do this from 6 o'clock in the morning until midnight? I can't go one more rally." And all they had to do really was just follow me around. But it dramatizes how we get used to different burdens that we carry. I suspect they found it as difficult being up on the stage making brief introductions of me as I would find trying to play pro football.
You mentioned that it was the tradition to keep the likely nominee under wraps, as it were, until the time of the acceptance speech. This year, the organizers are planning to have the likely nominee, Governor Clinton, very visible and out campaigning during the days of the convention until the final day. In retrospect, is one better than the other?
Oh, I think Clinton's absolutely right if he does that, because obviously the whole country is going to be focusing on politics during the national convention, whether it's ours or the Republican convention. And when I read that, I thought, gosh, that's brilliant, because he can go into New Jersey, he can go into Massachusetts, go into Pennsylvania, into the New England states, and be back in New York in an hour's time. So it's a great idea.
Who gave the keynote in 1972?
The keynote, isn't it strange? You know, I've temporarily just drawn a blank on who delivered the keynote in '72. That doesn't mean it wasn't a memorable speech. It just means I'm thinking about myself instead of something else. But I've forgotten who keynoted that convention.
It'll probably come to you.
It'll come to me before the end of the program.
You referenced the selection of your vice presidential choice. Would you walk me through that process?
Well, as you know, we had all kinds of difficulty with the vice presidential choice. I think one of the reasons was the fact that I didn't know I was going to be the nominee until the day before I was nominated. So I didn't have the luxury that, let us say, Bill Clinton has this year. He's known for months that he probably would be the Democratic nominee, as Dukakis did, and as Mondale did, and others. So they had lots of time to think about who their running mates would be. But until you actually know that you're going to be the nominee, and the country knows, it's very hard to talk seriously to people about running with you. It almost looks like you're bargaining for their support. in order to get them to be your running mate. But so we held off on that, but I did have 6 or 7 people in mind that I had thought about rather carefully. And when it became clear to me that I was the nominee in Miami, I called the first of those, only to have him turn me down. I called the second, the third. I went through the whole list. Every one of them turned me down.
Can you share any of those names with me?
Sure. The Governor Askew of Florida was a person I had talked to first. Senator Kennedy, who the poll showed would add a few points to the ticket, and who I had served with in the Senate for many years. I knew the family well. Senator Ribicoff of Connecticut, Senator Nelson of Wisconsin, Senator Mondale of Minnesota. Sarge Shriver was in Russia, and we couldn't get hold of him.
Why were you getting these turndowns?
They didn't think I had a chance to win. That was partly it. The only one who turned me down for other reasons was Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, who said he was afraid I might win. And then he said, I'll be stuck with that damn job for the next 4 years and maybe the next 8. But I think most of the others thought there was very little chance that I could be, that I could win against an incumbent, entrenched president as strong as Nixon was. Mondale was up for re-election to the Senate, so he had a pretty good reason not to do it. It would have interfered with his Senate race.
The person who ended up saying yes.
The person who ended up saying yes had actually been campaigning for it. He had told the press and told a number of people that he was interested in it, and told some of my advance people that he was interested. That was Senator Eagleton of Missouri. He had been in the Senate about 4 years. I hadn't served on any committees with Senator Eagleton. I really, frankly, didn't know him very well, and he had supported Senator Muskie in the bid for the nomination, so I really wasn't focusing on him. By the way, I asked Senator Muskie to be my running mate, too, and he turned it down. I think partly because he'd had it before. He'd been the party's nominee in 1968. But in any event, Senator Eagleton turned up on a number of people's lists as their second choice. People that had recommended Senator Mondale would say, if he doesn't take it, why don't you take a look at Eagleton? Mondale himself said that. Ted Kennedy recommended Eagleton. Mike Mansfield was strong for him. And so I finally decided that he'd be a good choice. He had strong relations with organized labor, which I didn't have. Mr. Meany was unhappy about my opposition to the war in Vietnam and some other things. In any event, we finally decided to go with Senator Eagleton, only to discover the problem of mental illness that he had had a few days later.
How was that? In fact, if I recall, there was press reports that he had received some sort of treatment at one point for depression. And how did that report actually become public?
Well, it was the press had it, the night newspapers. One of the a family member of one of the psychiatrists who had taken care of Senator Eagleton when he was hospitalized released the story to the press. And they even had some of the medical records. So that's how it came out. My first inclination was to stay with Senator Eagleton in any event, but we ran into so much difficulty with the party and with our contributors and with just about everybody we talked with that it looked like if we were going to get the campaign off the ground, we'd have to ask him to step down. And at that point, I turned to Sarge Shriver, who I had had on my original list, but who was off in the Soviet Union at the time of the convention, and he readily accepted. I think he was a good candidate.
Where exactly in the convention timetable did all this take place?
It took place after I was nominated, so it all took place within about a 24-hour period.
And do you recall the mood amongst your campaign organizers?
To be truthful about it, I think that the vice presidential selection was a low priority in our campaign. We were so focused on trying to win that nomination that we treated the vice presidential selection as a secondary matter. And you want to know something? That's the way it's almost always been treated until I got into difficulty with Senator Eagleton. Back in '52, for example, when Adlai Stevenson was nominated, one of his aides told me that they were sitting in the hotel in Chicago about midnight, and one of them suddenly said, Governor, I think you have to name a running mate sometime before tomorrow, or at least sometime before tomorrow afternoon. Have you thought about that? And he said, well, I really haven't. And somebody said, well, maybe we should have a Southerner. And since you're a governor, a northern governor, maybe we should try to find a southern senator. And so they thought about that for a few minutes. Somebody said, what about John Sparkman of Alabama? And they went around the room for a while, and most people thought it was a good choice, so they called Senator Sparkman and asked him if he'd take it. And after a couple of minutes, he said, well, I think I will. So that was it. There was no check, no questions asked, no investigation of his background. He was a public figure, and that was all that was required. That's the way it's ordinarily done.
So '72 ended up being something of a watershed in the process.
Yeah, in the sense that we ran into serious difficulty over the choice.
And by your earlier comments, you now think that the whole focus on who the running mate will be changed in that year?
Yes, I think since then people have given considerably more thought to avoid that kind of problem. I always thought, looking back on it, that we got hurt, first of all, by the confusion over the initial selection. And then I thought we were hurt even more when we backed away from it and picked somebody else. In retrospect, from a purely political standpoint, forget about everything else, from a purely political standpoint, we'd have been better off to stay with Senator Eagleton, because I was accused by some people of making a bad choice. I was accused by others of waffling and changing my mind. And in politics, it's almost as big a sin to change your mind as it is to be wrong.
Were those critics within the party or in the opposing party?
Everywhere, everywhere. They were in the press, they were in the party, they were in the other party. Obviously, my opponents did everything they could to maximize the difficulty. I personally think that one of the reasons George Bush refused to back away from Dan Quayle after that firestorm broke when he announced who he'd picked is that he remembered the difficulty I got into when I backed away from Senator Eagleton. I'm sure at some place in the back of his mind, maybe in the front of his mind, he and his advisors said, well, we don't want to make the mistake George McGovern did in changing from one vice presidential selection to another. I'm confident of that.
In the end, what did Sergeant Shriver bring to your ticket?
Well, Sergeant Shriver is a marvelous man. He's a person of just absolute integrity, first of all, and great humor and high spirit, an intelligent, experienced man who's been around the political circuits for a long time. He was highly admired as the first director of the Peace Corps. He was admired as the director of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. So he brought the most attractive foreign policy institutional experience we have, plus one of the most humane domestic efforts. He'd been chairman of the Chicago School Board. He was sort of an apple pie and motherhood and flag candidate, if there ever was one, and I thought he added a lot of enthusiasm and decency to the campaign.
You earlier referenced the fact that the Watergate break-in had occurred, and also that the Vietnam War was still going on. Were there protests outside the hall that you were aware of?
At our convention?
Yes.
What happened is that in the Miami convention, there were a group of radical young people who thought that I was making too many compromises. I said, for example, when I was asked about the withdrawal of American forces in Vietnam, if that wouldn't expose other American strategic interests in the Pacific. I said, well, I'm not talking about taking the 7th Fleet out of the Pacific. I'm not talking about closing down our military relationship with Thailand, which is next door. And that convinced some super radicals that George McGovern really wasn't an advocate of peace, and they flocked into the lobby of the hotel and organized a raucous demonstration. I finally went downstairs, much to the consternation of the Secret Service, and confronted them myself, face to face. And after 10, 15 minutes of conversation in which I explained my case and refused to back down to them, they left the hotel.
Did that incident have any effect on the convention?
I think it probably helped us some, because it showed, first of all, a presidential candidate who wasn't afraid to take on protesters face to face. I was sometimes labeled as too far to the left in opposing to the war. Here I was in a scene where I was speaking to people considerably further to the left than I was. On that matter, let me say this. I've never thought I was any big leftist. I thought opposition to the war was something of a conservative position. I never understood why conservatives didn't see it that way, and some of them did. Senator Aiken of Vermont, for example. But opposition to a foolish war is not a radical position, it's a conservative position. And that's the position I held.
Why do you think you lost the election?
I think that any time you take on an entrenched incumbent president who's shrewd enough to use the political power of the White House skillfully, you've got an almost impossible task. What did Nixon do in that election year? He went to China and opened up China. People almost forgot about Vietnam opening up relations with 1 billion people in China. He invoked wage and price controls. What other Republican president would have done that? It stopped inflation. He thirdly instructed the Federal Reserve, which they did, to let the money flow into the economy so that people could borrow money at reasonable rates. He worked out détente with the Soviet Union. He began pulling forces out of Vietnam so that it looked like we were getting out of the war rather than getting in. Never mind the fact that 40% of all the Americans who died in Vietnam died under the Nixon administration. All those things were very skillful moves that I think made Nixon unbeatable by the time Election Day rolled around.
Your party will again be challenging an incumbent president. Would you draw the same conclusion this year?
I would not, because George Bush has not handled things nearly as shrewdly or as skillfully as Richard Nixon did. He, for example, has done almost nothing to deal with the recession. We're in a very serious economic recession in the United States, and no amount of talk is going to blind people to that fact. This is a serious economic squeeze we're under, and I think it explains more than anything else why George Bush has slipped from 90% approval down to a small fraction of that. What is it, 25 or 30% approval now? So it's an entirely different situation. There's no exciting thing like a breakthrough to China taking place. There are no wage and price controls. There are no really constructive initiatives of any kind. No health policy. Nothing moving on the environment except to try to undercut the global effort that was recently underway in Brazil. So I think George Bush is in a very vulnerable position, and I honestly believe Bill Clinton has a good chance to win this election. I don't know where Mr. Perot is going to fit into this picture. He's a kind of an unknown factor. I'm like most Americans. I don't know very much about him other than that he's got a lot of money.
How does the Democratic Party use its prior nominees?
I think they tend to throw them on the ash heap, to be candid about it. Once you've run for the presidency and lost in the Democratic Party, you're considered a kind of a dead dodo. You're seldom consulted on anything. You're seldom recognized unless it's something you've done purely on your own. I'm not bitter about this. I'm content to live a private life, and I've had a good time since I ran in '72. I wouldn't take anything for that experience. I thought very seriously about running again in 1992, but my wife and my family and my good friends convinced me it would be a mistake to do that. But I must say, as far as the party is concerned, an ex-Democratic nominee is pretty low on the totem pole.
In fact, you believe that they have something to contribute to the campaign itself?
I'm not sure of that. I personally think that I learned a lot of mistakes to avoid. I think I learned where some of the pitfalls are. I think I would have something to say. I think I'd have something to say on the great issues before the country. I'm appalled at how some of the central questions are being ignored in this campaign, particularly the development of a post-Cold War agenda, both at home and abroad. The world has changed so dramatically with the collapse of the Soviet Union that we could change things fundamentally, both at home and abroad ourselves, but there's not much indication that's going to happen based on what we've heard in this campaign so far. So I think I could be helpful in helping to shape the issues, but I suppose what is going on in the heads of other Democrats, they say, well, this is the guy that lost 49 states. Why do we need to talk to him?
And they haven't.
No.
Where will you be at the 1992 convention?
Well, I'm going to go to the convention, and I'll be in a small New York hotel watching it, and probably on the floor a few times during the sessions. We're doing one thing that I think is going to be lots of fun. We're having a 20th anniversary reunion of the people that were especially active in the '72 campaign. So we've scheduled a tattoo club in New York for the opening night of the convention. Our party won't begin until the convention adjourns, but between about 10 o'clock at night on Monday, July 13th, and 1 o'clock the next morning, there'll be a McGovern 20th anniversary reunion. That's the day that I won the nomination 20 years ago. So instead of making a speech at 3:30 in the morning, we'll be having a pleasant party, I think, that evening.
Are you opening that to interested people in the media that want to cover it?
Oh, sure. The media's welcome. We always welcome the media. People will probably come and go during the evening, but there'll be good food and maybe an occasional drink available. So people that are vitally interested in '72 and what's happened to the '72 team since then are invited. I talked to Warren Beatty the other night and invited him and his new wife to come, and I'm hoping they'll be there. And I think there'll be some of the other celebrities come, as well as the people that did a lot of the hard work in the campaign.
Senator, we're just about out of time, but we opened the conversation with your personal, most vivid memories. What about history's most important notations on the 1972?
They're going to note the change in the composition of the convention. They're going to report that instead of 15% of the delegates being women, that we bumped that up to about 40%. They're going to note that instead of the blacks being 2 or 3% of the convention, that they were up to close to 20%. They'll take note of the fact that instead of young people under 30 being excluded, that they played a major role in the '72 convention, which they should have, because the central issue before the country was the war in Vietnam, and everybody in Vietnam was under 30. They'll take note of the fact that the convention was open to the delegates to speak, to make known their ways in total freedom. It was, in every sense, a wide open convention, unstructured, uncontrolled. We paid some political price for that, but I think historians will note that it was perhaps one of the most representative Democratic conventions, Democratic with a small d, that this country's ever witnessed.
Former Senator George McGovern, Senator from South Dakota from 1963 through 1981, and the 1972 Democratic Party nominee for president. Thank you very much for talking with C-SPAN.
Pleasure.
Join us Sunday on C-SPAN 2 for a look back at speeches from past Democratic National Conventions. We will show you keynote and nomination speeches from 1948 to 1988. Our special convention programming will be seen tonight beginning at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. Just ahead, it's a conversation with former Vice President and 1984 Democratic presidential nominee Walter Mondale. For more than a decade, C-SPAN has brought you live gavel-to-gavel coverage